Begin with this. The Vienna SOE file cabinets in Baker Street still carry anomalies, page counts that don't match, transit logs without signatures, and a handful of op sheets where the authorization blocks have been physically razored out. In wartime London, there were hundreds of recruit biographies that were processed without debate, but only a handful were processed without attribution. The handful almost always lived in the grey space between the Balkans and the Danube, the Allied blind spot. And one of those was the Vienna-born linguist, who would later be known to us only through his archival alias. C41 Vienna, for Britain, was a problem space before it ever became an intelligence goldmine. In 1943, as the war entered the stage of rail hubs and fuel arithmetic, Churchill's senior intelligence staff concluded that the German war economy could be choked faster by deranging freight timetables than by bombing oil refineries. SOE Section 5, the analysis wing inside the wider sabotage machine, was told to identify where the Reich bent. Vienna, sitting on the Danube trunk, the southern transshipment beds, and the cut-through nodes into Slovakia, Hungary, and Croatia, was a load-bearing rib in that skeleton. By early 1943, an exfiltrated Austrian lawyer from Mariahilf testified in Bari that trains leaving Ostbahnhof to the southeast were so overloaded with troop and munitions consignments that they were leaving yards late 4 days out of 7. Someone needed to be inside that city to measure the choke. C41 checked every column in the SIS recruiting rubric. Viennese birth, 5 languages, lived in exile long enough to avoid 1941-42 register drift, Catholic upbringing, anti-fascist students' cell in 1938, no surveillance traces by Abwehr 3B. He was transferred from a Cairo cutout pipeline to Bari via small RAF Dakota courier runs, where SOE, not SIS, ran the psychological scrape. He was never assigned a glamour number. No blown bridges, SOE NESI 62 profile. Just an internal linguist charter for traffic annotation and atmospherics. It was an intelligence analyst assignment, conducted from inside the target city. The British handlers, the men who debriefed him, were from a department that has almost vanished in popular memory. The Section 5 field adjudicators. Their job was not to train or task saboteurs, but to rank the value of what a source said, line by line. C41's advantage was microscopic. He sounded Viennese. London notation, accent drift nil. Spies have been recruited for less. In late 1943, he was inserted into the chain of cutouts and couriers, the Viennese anti-Nazi dissident world. Not the romantic underground of film scripts, but tiny clusters of 2 and 3, operating around cafes, tobacconists, factory cloakrooms, and tram stops, built on the oldest Austrian habit, not saying a thing directly. C41 wrote on grocery receipts, theatre bills, paper torn from the blank inside flap of tram schedules. The micronotes became the British foothold into Danube rail flows, and it was these reports, not his moral biography, that made him indispensable. From London's viewpoint, his reporting hit the one geographical seam Bletchley Park never fully solved, the ground truth backstage of German freight. British air staff wanted to bomb oil refineries and yards, but the codebreakers quietly wanted to model the network. C41 was one of the only humans inside Vienna who could tell, without intercepts, when the Germans were padding timetables to conceal congestion. But the Germans could feel the drag, because whenever an empire pulls freight off its timetable, it becomes a palpably slower machine. Abwehr 4A, counter-espionage, began tracking courier drift in Vienna in the winter of 1943-44. They didn't know the name, but they knew there was a leak. This is the moment where the mystery begins to tighten, because Berlin's surveillance grid was ratcheting upward, and yet SOE refused to exfiltrate C41. They judged his reporting irreplaceable. London told Bari, "Keep him in place. It is not hard with hindsight to understand the cruelty the Allies were building, the ultra-exploit on railway statistics, and C41's human eyes were validating this numbers. Late 1943 is therefore the first hinge in this story, the moment when operational value was allowed to override survivability. The British would later argue, quietly, never on the record, that this was the last necessary gamble before D-Day. The record is not conclusive on that. But the Vienna files show a choice, calculated, unknowing, to leave a man in place because his signal was strategically relevant. And so the stage was set. A single linguist, reporting on a city where every safe room was slowly being sieved. In the Vienna of 1943, the spy who would disappear still existed. Here is a rarely cited technical detail. OSS X2, the counterintelligence branch, tracked its most sensitive European human sources not by name, not even by cryptonym, but by geographic vector. An X2 Vienna vector in early 1944 meant something very specific to Washington and London. This was a source whose reporting could map Gestapo forays, counter-resistance sweeps in near real time, and the British were the ones feeding fragments from Vienna to Bletchley Park, where operational throughput models were stress testing the very arteries of the Reich. When C-41 began reporting that evening rail departures from Ostbahnhof into Slovakia were oppressively padded, two different Allied worlds snapped into alignment. The codebreakers could measure German panic mathematically, and the field officers could measure it atmospherically from inside a city that believed itself armored by fear. Across 1944, the Vienna reporting string was a three-tier relay: micronotes into courier hands into OSS Bern into the British in London. The speed was never fast, but the feedback was alive. And it was alive at the moment operational risk in Vienna was peaking. This is also when Allied decryption gave the British one terrible certainty. Abwehr reform, Berlin's anti-resistance purge directive, was coming into the Austrian capital next. Counterinsurgency algorithms in wartime Europe were not theoretical. They were timed by rail watches. When the RAF struck Bulgarian yards in early 44, Berlin pulled manpower from the Vienna zone to reinforce Balkan flanks, and every lateral troop transfer radiated through the Danube railbeds like a bruise. C-41's tiny grocery paper scribbles confirmed what Ultra was implying in numbers. The Germans were bending, and they were bending at the Danube throat. But the tightening did not only come from the Germans. Behind the Swiss neutrality screen in Bern, OSS X2 officers had begun a sub-narrative, a quiet suspicion that the British might be holding back assets they considered too valuable to share fully. In one file, unclassified only in the late 2000s, an X2 desk officer writes, "British unwilling to remove Vienna asset, believed irreplaceable for Ultra co-validation." OSS had a different operational instinct. Burn the position before the position burns you. SOE Section 5 rejected that, and the clerical paper trail proves it. For months, they rejected it. A London minute sheet dated 14th of February 1944 contains a single margin note: "No exfil, continue feeds." That instruction was initialed by a Section 5 adjudicator whose descendants still refuse interviews. The cruelest detail is the most mundane. We know exactly when C-41 made an early request for extraction, a request that was essentially ignored. In the Q files, there is a microfiche enlargement of a torn date fragment from one of his Vienna notes. The paper was once a coat-check ticket from the Theater an der Wien. It reads, "Raids intensifying. Buildings on Karlsplatz suspect. Request floor contact." The British inserted 2 new one-time pads into his chain in response. That is, they wanted more signals, not exit. And yet the Germans were now inches away. Gestapo foray in Vienna was not a caricature. It was an advanced, technically literate counter-espionage apparatus that had already cracked multiple courier networks in France. They practiced shadow courier manipulation, allowing a compromised runner to continue for 10 to 14 days to map their network before silently lifting him. That was the part London misread. They thought the courier collapses meant they had time. In fact, they meant the opposite. The nets were already tagged. But the real accelerant was Soviet. In early 1944, Soviet intelligence, sensing the war was pivoting toward the Balkans, began moving NKVD forward observers into Austrian borderlands to prepare for the eventual Red Army advance. Soviet intelligence was not working in partnership with Britain in Vienna. They were already pre-forming their post-war dominance game. And from London's perspective, this meant one thing: the British were now trying to run a human source in a city that would soon be owned by Moscow. And the Soviets would know exactly who had been recruiting Austrians against the Reich. Intelligence is not only risk, it is timing. The entire London calculus. Keep the human asset in place because Ultra needs validation, assumed the city would remain German long enough for that validation to matter. But by mid-1944, the Soviet advance had become gravitational. Vienna was no longer just a German hub. It was becoming an Allied custody window, 4 powers converging on one space where every intelligence archive, every human source, every signal would be a prize. Which raises the question that still makes modern intelligence officers uncomfortable. When London refused to pull C-41, was it because of the German threat, or because they knew that once the Red Army entered Vienna, they might never see that source again? Part 2 ends on this fulcrum, a hinge of calculation rather than compassion, and C-41 was still in the field, still writing, while 3 superpowers began treatyless competition for the city he was trapped inside. Begin here, with the view from the ruined northern bank of the Danube in the first days of April 1945, because the geography matters. Vienna is not a medieval core the way Paris is. It is a Baroque imperial layout wrapped in modern industrial ribs. The Gürtel, the Ringstrasse, the tramwebs, and then the higher land that slopes to the Vienna woods. When the Red Army's 3rd Ukrainian Front closed the final ring around the capital between 2/11 April, these topographies decided who lived, who died, and who vanished into the administrative fog of post-battle Vienna. And standing somewhere in that collapsing urban geometry, not a saboteur, not a soldier, but a data collector, was C-41. The Allied picture of Vienna in early April 1945 often looks triumphal in the newsreels, but the intelligence picture is the opposite. A maze, a panic. On the German side, SS-Brigadeführer Karl Treuenfeld commanded SS-Kampfgruppe Treuenfeld around the central districts. The Volkssturm dug fighting positions around the Gürtel. The Wehrmacht's 6th Panzer Army, bled white from Hungary, could not hold the line. The rail system, C-41's fixation for 20 months, finally locked up. The Gestapo files show that by 3 April, cargo traffic from Vienna to Bratislava collapsed to under 20% of nominal throughput. The bureaucracy was dying, and in the death of bureaucracy, chaos is a screen. This is the moment when Soviet SMERSH detachments, operational counterintelligence units, became the new gravitational force in the city. They arrived not as liberators, not as police, but as first claimants. Over the invisible, lists, registries, dossiers, dead officers' briefcases, intact office safes. In Berlin's last days, hardened German counterintelligence staff burned files, but Vienna fell too fast. Dozens of registry books survived in partially intact form, and if you were a Soviet SMERSH officer in April, you understood something the British and Americans only recognized months too late. Vienna was not simply a city in collapse. It was an intelligence jackpot. The Western Allies did not have physical ground access yet, so all London and Washington could do was keep the last gossamer-thin signal threads alive. The British inserted 2 new one-time pads for C-41 into his courier chain. Those deliveries were logged, but there is no corresponding return. That is the moment the cold dread enters the archive. The single surviving outgoing signal, Kahlenbergerdorf, compromised, requesting ground contact, is consistent with the topographic logic of April 1945. Kahlenbergerdorf sits underneath the slopes of the Leopoldsberg, above the Danube's northern arc. As German lines folded back towards city centre, refugees, Volkssturm detachments, wounded stragglers all flood north. The courier routes shift. The woods become a transit corridor, not a sanctuary. C-41, who had been reporting on bureaucratic freight flows, not battle orders, now issues a report grounded in immediate survival. That message is not intelligence, it is a survival flare. And then, silence. The British historiography is uncomfortable with this silence, because agencies like SOE, like tidy operational narratives, infiltrate, collect, survive, extract. But the collapse of Vienna is not tidy. Soviet NKVD special sections are known to have pre-interrogated any captured German counterintelligence bureau they could get hands on, not because they loved or trusted the Reich apparatus, but because abuse of the abuser yields fast intelligence. Soviet patterns in Königsberg and in East Prussia in February-March 1945 show identical behavior. Every German who knew how to classify other humans was now a target, and a tool, which implies the most plausible dark truth. If Gestapo 4A knew the Vienna courier networks were penetrated, Smersh would know within days. So what happens to a British wartime human source who is neither a partisan nor a German collaborator, but a British asset, trapped inside a city where the Soviets are beginning to treat the archives of the Third Reich as a menu of intelligence opportunities? The record suggests a triage that is not written in any Geneva Convention manual. We know from Soviet memoir fragments that Smersh classified some captured Allied clandestine assets as temporary, meaning use for extraction of institutional knowledge, then classify as absorbed. Absorbed is an NKVD word of bureaucratic finality. It means this person's past identity will not survive the new political arithmetic. So Part 3 ends with a single, narrow possibility space, and the smallest possible clue inside it. The British do not record C-41 as dead. The Soviets do not record him as alive. The city around him is burning. The rail nodes he measured with microscopic precision for nearly 2 years are seizing into immobility. Vienna is collapsing into Soviet custody, and the only official British echo is a single, horrifyingly terse signal. Kahlenbergerdorf compromised, requesting ground contact. There is no evidence ground contact ever arrived. The occupation map of Vienna in mid-1946 is, in hindsight, one of the most unstable administrative geometries of the entire century. 4 flags, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, all superimposed on a city whose infrastructure had just been cratered, shelled, looted, and then opportunistically re-archived by the Red Army. What the public remembers is the romantic image, Vienna as the spy capital of early Cold War cinema. What the archival reality shows is harder, much colder. Vienna was the city where the West first had to ask itself whether its own wartime agents had survived long enough to be flipped by its newest allies. And this is the axis on which the C-41 question turns. The NKVD and later MGB had a central advantage, physical custody of much of the paper. The Soviets had private access to Gestapo 4A's Q files, index books, arrest card registries, interrogation day sheets, and the stray card index drawers salvaged from buildings long since blown out. The West had to reconstruct by interviewing survivors, by trading fragments, by comparing charred page counts. The British SOE had its own original wartime case files, but these were human source facing. They did not show what had happened after Vienna fell. And here is the part that modern intelligence historians still find unnerving. As early as the second quarter of 1946, internal MI5D branch audit teams flagged the wartime Vienna human assets as risk fields in an entirely new category: VAT surrender foreign custody. The underlying fear was not death. The underlying fear was compromise through survival. There is one short document, almost overlooked, with a notation from one of these MI5 reviewers, written in a tucked-in pencil margin. Vienna, unknown custody vector assets. Assume some operations suffered hostile interrogation. Do not treat as secure. The implication is devastating. Suggests that for at least a subset of cases, the British no longer trusted their own wartime. Sources C-41's record during this phase becomes a vacuum surrounded by speculation. The file is shuttled across desks. In the MI5 paper log, his wartime code doesn't get struck. It gets cross-gridded into a new Cold War index, a practice never formally acknowledged in public histories. Possible former HUMINT, Vienna, Soviet contact risk. At this point, the larger intelligence landscape has already tilted. The US wartime OSS has been dissolved, October 1945. Its X-2 counterintelligence cadres fragment into new bodies, some into the short-lived SSU, some eventually into CIA Directorate of Plans. The British SOE is being wound down. Its residual intelligence functions are being ingested into SIS MI6. So the people in London trying to answer the C-41 question, did we lose him? They are doing so amid institutional metamorphosis. This is when the problem becomes less about war and more about bureaucratic physics. The British might have pulled him, but no one still working the case has the authority to retask extraction infrastructure. The Americans might have tried to find him through the new Vienna base, but they don't fully own the wartime context. The French sector is there physically, but they don't have the charter. Meanwhile, the Soviet MGB physically owns the ground where the answers are buried. Vienna is now a four-power city with a collapsed human chain of accountability. In that vacuum, suspicion is not paranoia. It's a survival algorithm. British internal memoranda begin to adopt a new framing. Berlin and Vienna, wartime. Humans should be treated as open vectors. The phrase is clinical, but the meaning is blunt. Do not treat missing wartime assets as allies simply because they were once ours. Men who survived Hitler could, through coercion, survive Stalin. And in surviving Stalin, become instruments of Stalin. Which leads to the new dark hypothesis. If C-41 did survive, the people most likely to know his fate were not the British who ran him, but the Soviet officers who captured his city. By late 1946, the British internal reasoning has inverted. The problem is no longer, did the Germans kill him? The problem is now, did someone else keep him alive? The questions become strategic, not emotional. If the Soviets had recovered a wartime British human asset, would they declare him? Why would they? He would be infinitely more useful as a quiet, unacknowledged lever, a means of reverse mapping the British source recruitment logic in occupied Austria. So Part 4 closes on an unresolved pivot. We transition from wartime stakes, survival, to cold war stakes, ownership. And somewhere in this shift, C-41's status in British ledgers changes from missing asset to potential adversarial vector, but on paper, he remains what he was in April 1945, alive or dead, unknown. The discovery happens quietly, and that is why it matters. In 1950, at the CIA Vienna base, a building technically seated in the American zone, but functionally a split jurisdiction labyrinth, a routine dead-drop rewalk yields a piece of paper that should not exist. A tiny unsigned note on cheap Austrian newsprint stock. The CIA officer who logged it was not even looking for legacy British cases. He was mapping courier habits for a post-war illegal residentura. But this scrap of paper detonated an old ghost. It referenced two WWII couriers by extremely specific local route code, both of whom had died in 1944, attempting Danube transits. Those route codes had not been publicly disclosed. They were never printed in newspapers. They existed only in internal Allied cable traffic, which is why the Vienna base called London. It is here, in this hinge year of 1950, that the bureaucracies of two wars collide. The Dorte wartime intelligence chains and the early CIA MI6 Cold War architecture. And in that collision zone sits the tiny, unnamed, undated note, which displays two contradictory fingerprints, precise UK wartime human source knowledge. A. Distinctly Soviet lexical inversion, a type of phrase rotation that MI6 Russianists later classified as MGB hand. This is the moment when C-41 goes from missing to something worse, signal. Because whoever authored that note, whoever placed it at the dead drop, was signaling, and it looked like they were signaling in two languages at the same time. The note, according to the CIA, base incident log contained one sentence. Those two never reached the river mouth. It is banal on the face, but river mouth was one of C-41's correct insider linguistic habits. He used the Austrian mouth-to-gorge metaphor for Danube directional flow, and the note inverted the usual Soviet-style grammar order, a known MGB habit when echoing, West-coded phrasing, which yields three possibilities, each nightmare grade. A. C-41 survived the fall of Vienna, and is now talking through a Soviet or post-Soviet filter. B. A Soviet officer is imitating C-41 to misdirect Western post-war HUMINT mapping. Coup. C-41 was interrogated in 1945-46. His phrasing patterns were recorded, and his voice is now a tool for deception. In 1950, all three are plausible. And here is the flashpoint you almost never see written plainly. This one scrap of paper forces MI6 to acknowledge a possibility they had avoided for 5 years. C-41 may not have been killed. He may have been repurposed. This is where the mood in London shifts from tragic loss to active, counterintelligence puzzle, and it lands in the worst possible moment in institutional time. Because by 1950, the Western services are no longer built for wartime human grit. They're built for analytic stability. The bureaucratic instinct is not recover him. The bureaucratic instinct is quarantine the vector. And so, rather than expand the search field, the British begin to seal it. There is an MI6 desk note dated October 1950, a cold phrase, clipped onto the PF series personnel folder by hand. No contact, no approach, no revalidation. That is the moment that defines the modern C-41 problem. The British no longer seek him, they freeze him in place, wherever that place is. Because by 1950, the calculus has inverted yet again. Missing wartime asset is easier to contain than a potentially compromised one. The Vienna base note, the tiny scrap, now becomes a spectral artifact of two wars. WWII, the war he served in. Cold War, the war where his ghost becomes a risk. But one thing remains unclear. And this ambiguity is what prevents C-41 from becoming a closed file. Did someone write that note to warn the West? Or did someone write that note to show the West that they owned what the West once owned? Part 5 ends here, on the razor edge between survivor signal and adversarial taunt. The paper fragment exists. The hand remains unknown. We begin in 1953, the year London makes the most final-sounding decision it can make without actually making one. And to understand the last official move in the C-41 story, we have to look at how British bureaucracy erases without erasing. When Whitehall wants something gone, but not gone in a way that triggers archival absence, they perform a code conversion. They alter the meaning of the thing, not the pages. They do not delete. They relabel, and that is exactly what happens to the PFA 17836 file, the case file that once held C-41's wartime operational traffic. In 1953, that number is altered in place. The folder is not closed. It is not marked deceased. It is not marked burned. It is not even marked inactive. Instead, in a tiny pen hand, the British archivist writes 4 words: assume absorbed Vienna. It is the closest the British state ever comes to admitting defeat on a human individual without documenting an actual death. Absorbed is not a euphemism for killed. It is a bureaucratic category for pulled across a border into an adversarial custody that cannot be reversed and for which no intervention channel exists. And then nothing. That is the real ending, the institutional ending of C-41, but it is not the human ending, because the most dangerous part of the C-41 case is not what the British wrote. It is what the British never learned. And here is the paradox we are left with. No Allied service ever produced a conclusive document confirming C-41's death. No Soviet service ever produced a conclusive document confirming C-41's life. The Vienna base scrap of 1950 remains the last possible contact. The archiving shift of 1953 remains the final Western verdict. And in that gap is where the modern intelligence services, MI6, BND, CIA, still quietly mark their deepest institutional fear. The people who survived the Second World War without a record are the scariest ghosts of the Cold War. Because there is one more layer, the layer historians are only beginning to investigate now. Because the files only started unsealing in the 2000s and 2010s. After 1953, Vienna becomes the marketplace for defectors, double agents, and false flag walk-ins. By 1955, neutral Austrian sovereignty returns, and Vienna becomes the final handoff door between Soviet and Western zones. In this city, there were hundreds of appearances, men who claimed to be former partisan couriers, former Gestapo interpreters, former foreign legionaries, former escapees from Soviet organs, and for every 100 claims, maybe 4 were real, which leads to the last, quiet question that senior counterintelligence officers still argue about in classrooms at Garmisch and at Langley, not because they know the answer, but because the question itself terrifies them. What if C-41 understood, in April 1945, that the only way to survive a city being swallowed by a new empire was to become valuable to that empire? There is no heroism or villainy in that question, only physics, because in 1945, inside Vienna, the Soviets had ground custody. The British did not. If you were inside that perimeter and you wanted to not die, you talked. And if you talked, even once, then by 1953, you belong to the ledger of the people you talked to, and that ledger does not release its dead. So this is where the entire 10-year arc, 1943 to 1953, lands. The wartime signal is clean, the man was real, the wartime reporting is clean, the intelligence was valuable, the fall of Vienna is clean, the city changed sovereigns. Everything after is quantum fog. And the British reaction to that fog was not denial. It was something even colder. Administrative acceptance. The 1953 notation does not say that C-41 is dead. It says he is gone from us, which is the more frightening category, and that is why the C-41 file remains, to this day, one of the only active WWII personnel files never closed, cleanly, because the intelligence community knows something the public rarely confronts. In war, people die. In espionage, people disappear, and sometimes, the ones who disappear are never actually gone. They are only uncounted.